Thank you, Walter, for the always wonderful introduction, and thank you, Humanities team, more generally. This is particularly exciting for me, being in person. This is the first presentation I've done since the pandemic began, so I did not jump on the virtual presentation bandwagon that everyone was kind of forced to jump on. I was fortunately in a position where I was tenured and I didn't feel compelled to present my research during the pandemic. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to kind of get back into the swing of things and presenting my work. And the work that I'm going to present today is done with my junior colleague, Ken Gourlay. He's a master's student in our program. Give you a little bit of background and kind of the origins of the project. When the pandemic hit, so much research efforts went into studying the various effects of the pandemic. I was very reluctant to do that type of research. It was just very, just not into studying the pandemic. I was just trying to survive with 2 kids at home, that were home a whole year. But last spring, I finally started thinking, all right, let's do some pandemic-related research. And so I talked to Ken, and we developed kind of 2 projects. And one project was something that I wanted to test, and then I asked him what he wanted to test within the general scope of tipping and the restaurant. And so he came up with an experiment that he wanted to run. And so we ran these experiments in a single survey, so they're both survey experiments. And so the first experiment that is related to face masks. So about 3 months after the pandemic, One Fair Wage did a survey of restaurant servers, and they found that 80% of servers reported experiencing a decline in their tipped wages. For roughly 50%, the decline was quite severe. It was over a 50% decline. And so there's various reasons why servers' tipped incomes declined following the onset of the pandemic. Obviously, reduced patronage, capacity restrictions, and the accompanying reduction in servers' hours resulted in lower tipped wages. There was a transition from in-person dining to takeout, and people tend to tip less for takeout orders compared to in-person dining. The financial hardship that the pandemic levied on low-wage earners in particular also resulted in them being less generous in their tipping when they went out to restaurants, when they were able to go out to restaurants. And then the overall sullen mood and the social distancing mandates that restricted servers' ability to interact closely with their customers also likely had an effect, although that effect has not been documented. But just logically, I suspect that it did have an effect on consumers' tipping generosity. So what hadn't been done, I was kind of surprised because, like I said, I was kind of late to the game of getting into studying pandemic effects. But last spring, when I had this idea, I thought about, well, what's the effect of servers being required to wear a face mask on customers tipping? And so I did a quick Google search and could find very little that had actually looked at the effect of face coverings on consumers' behavior more generally, but particularly restaurant consumers' behavior. So the logic was that wearing a mask would also likely have a dampening effect on consumers' tipping behavior. So there is research that links an open mouth smile with consumers' tipping behavior. The whole service mantra, the mantra that service with a smile is kind of underscores the basic logic that would drive a reduction in consumers' tipping behavior. So at the bottom there is kind of the basic process that I wanted to test. So is wearing a mask, does it have a negative effect on consumers' perceptions of the server's friendliness because they can't see those facial cues of friendliness, they can't see those visible cues of affect, and as a result of those diminished perceptions of friendliness, do they tend to tip less than they otherwise would in the event that they could see servers' face and facial expressions. So, as I was reading and searching and seeing if anyone's done this, there was one study that had been done in a retail setting. And so this study made me realize that it's also possible that consumers are able to see positive displays of emotions, such as an authentic smile, in the eyes of service providers. If that's the case, then wearing a mask might not have any effect on consumers' perceptions of service friendliness or their tipping behavior. So the idea basically is that when you smile, you develop what they call crow's feet in your eyes. And so you can tell if people are smiling even with a mask on. So this particular study that I found was done by Hoffman et al. And it too was a vignette experiment, and it included a mask and an open mouth smile manipulation of a hypothetical frontline employee of a fashion retail. And they found that respondents in the mask conditions rated the hypothetical employee's emotional display significantly more positively when they were smiling compared to the condition when they were not smiling. So 2 retail workers, one smiling without a mask, one smiling with a mask, and so, and then the other conditions were not smiling with a mask and without a mask. And so the smiling conditions were rated significantly more positively than the non-smiling conditions, irrespective of whether they were wearing a mask or not. And further, the authentic smile had a positive effect on customer outcomes, advice taking, social rapport, satisfaction, irrespective of whether or not the hypothetical frontline employee was depicted wearing a mask. In fact, the study also found that wearing a mask mitigated the negative effects of not smiling on consumer outcomes. So in the event that the retail worker was not smiling, the mask itself mitigated the negative effect that otherwise has on these consumer outcomes. So that was basically some support for an expectation of a null effect. So while we were predicting that there would be a negative effect of a mask on tips through perceptions or diminished perceptions of friendliness, we also acknowledge that there is a good chance that there might not be any effect here. Further, it could be the case that the pandemic and the mask that emerged out of the pandemic could have actually increased consumers' tipping behavior. So some customers may have responded to visible cues of the pandemic, such as the mask, by tipping their service providers more generously than they otherwise would if such cues were absent. So in other words, and to quote prolific tipping scholar Mike Lynn, it is possible that periods of crisis increase perceptions of relative fortune among those less affected by the crisis, and thereby enhance gratitude for services received, awarenesses of the cost involved in providing those services, and or perceptions of servers' need for assistance, all of which would encourage tipping and increase tip amounts. So those are kind of the 3 basic outcomes that we were expecting going into the research. And so with Ken's assistance, we created a survey, and as I said, we embedded 2 experiments in that survey, and then we fielded the survey to MTurk workers. So in total, we had 1,422 MTurk workers that completed the survey for a nominal reward. And this is the independent variable, is the mask manipulation. So each one of these is basically a clean test of the effects of the mask. You can see that we also manipulated the server's sex and also manipulated the server's race. But the cleanest manipulation, if you will, is that of the mask. So respondents were shown a picture and asked to imagine that they had taken a friend or family member out for dinner at a local restaurant, and then they received just one of these pictures. So there were 12 different conditions or 6 distinct experimental tests of the mask. And those masks, by the way, were just superimposed on models by Ken. Following the vignette, respondents were asked to report in dollars and cents how much they would tip their server if the bill was $57.54 and they were satisfied with both the food and quality of service. Next, we displayed the same photograph that had previously been randomly assigned to respondents and asked them to report on a 7-point scale how friendly the server appeared. And that was our measure of perceived friendliness. Finally, at the end of the survey, there was a block of items that included questions to tap altruistic tipping motives and reciprocity tipping motives. So more generally, do people tip to reward good service? More generally, do people tip for altruistic reasons, to help servers financially? So, to get into the results. So this is, what I'm going to do now is just go through each of those 6 distinct tests and test of the causal effect of a mask on perceptions of friendliness and tipping behavior. And so you'll see that with regard to these first 2, there is no statistical difference between the mask conditions and the non-mask conditions in terms of tipping behavior. But you do find a difference in perceptions of friendliness. So the masked server here is perceived significantly less friendly than the exact same photograph above without the mask. And the same pattern emerges here, although it's not quite statistically significant. Directionally, it is consistent with the white male server. So if we look at the black male server, you see again that there is no difference in tipping between the conditions. The black female server, no difference in tipping between the conditions. But you see a difference in perceptions of friendliness. So the masked black male is perceived to be less friendly than the comparable non-masked black male. And while not statistically significant, again, the pattern with regard to the black female is exactly the same. The black female who is masked is perceived to be less friendly than her counterpart, non-masked condition. So following the exact same with the Hispanic male and female, you see no difference in tipping between the masked and non-masked condition. You see the same general pattern here, though, with regard to perceptions, although it's much less disparate. But the Hispanic female, it is quite a bit different. So the respondents perceived her to be less friendly when she was wearing a mask. And then the bottom is the total. So just looking at the total, the difference in tips between the conditions was 3 cents. So basically, the respondents reported they tipped exactly the same whether the server was wearing a mask or not. But there is, as you would expect given our discussions to this point, there was a significant difference with regard to perceptions of friendliness overall. So this leaves open the possibility of a mediation process. So this leaves open the possibility that our prediction that masks would have a negative effect on perceptions of friendliness and in turn would dampen consumers tipping. So we wanted to test whether that mediation was there. And then we also wanted to test whether this process varied by people's motivations to tip for altruistic or reciprocity reasons. So we test for the mediation, and the main thing in this figure that you want to look at is this indirect effect. So if 0 is not contained between these two numbers, it indicates that it's significant. And so the coefficient is 0.15, so it's basically telling us that there is a significant negative indirect effect of wearing a mask on tipping through perceptions of friendliness. And that effect is literally translated into 15 cents. So it's a very small indirect effect. Statistically, it is significant. In practice, it's not that meaningful. 15 cents. The next thing we wanted to do is look at, oh, and another thing I'll comment on. So the previous slides that I've shown, basically that told us that there was, on average, there was no difference, right? 3 cents. So this negative 15 cents that we observe here, indirect effect, is clearly offset by other factors that's wiping the indirect effect out. So keep that in mind. But then we wanted to look at whether this indirect effect varied as a function of these tipping motivations. So in the top part of the slide, we're focused on altruistic tipping motivations. And you see that there is a significant difference in the size of the indirect effect across levels of altruistic tipping motivation. So the effect is nearly 18% for folks who do not tip for altruistic reasons more generally. And then you get down to the folks who are high on our altruistic tipping motive measure, and the effect is cut down to 8 cents. So the tipping, for people who tip for altruistic reasons, they're less sensitive to the negative effect that the mask has on perceptions of servers' friendliness. But reciprocity tipping motives does not seem to make much of a difference at all. So for folks who, more generally speaking, tip to reward good service, they are just as adversely affected by the servers having a mask on as their counterparts who do not tip for reciprocity reasons. So, in short, we find support for a null relationship between wearing a mask and customers' tipping behavior. So that's good news for restaurant servers, especially given that many restaurant servers are still wearing masks, and who knows, with all the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, there may come a time where they are mandated to wear a mask again. And to the degree that happens, they don't need to worry that wearing a mask is going to hurt them financially. As I mentioned, the mask was associated with lower tips. As a result, customers diminished perceptions of their friendliness, and this was especially the case among those who do not tip for altruistic reasons. But this effect is offset by other factors because, again, ultimately there was no difference on average. One thing that I wish we would have included in our survey was a measure of partisanship. Masks have become so political. Liberals wearing them to signal social responsibility and concern for others. Republicans or conservatives refraining from doing so as a declaration of individual freedom. So it would have been interesting to see if consumers respond differently to a mask in terms of their partisanship. So that was something that we didn't do, that somebody could do, and it would be interesting. So that is the end of the study that I led. Ken and I just got this paper published, so this is off the table now. And then now we're working on Ken's research. So I'll let him take the stage and he could kind of explain what he did here.
All right, thanks. So as Dr. Brewster said, I'm Kenneth Gourlay. I'm a master's student in the sociology department, and my area of interest is in sexuality and gender, in particular how public discourse sort of affects the understanding of sexuality and gender. So when Dr. Brewster approached me to ask him to work with him on this project, I sort of asked, well, how can we make it sexual? In other words, what relationship is there between tipping practices, masks, and sexuality? And I looked at some of the research that was out there and saw that there was indeed some that showed that the color red can influence tips, and that is the color red is sort of an identifier or an indicator of sexual readiness or sexual availability. And so there definitely was a sexual component there. So I thought that would be an interesting study. And so the question that I was asking then is, how does this actually apply in restaurant server tipping? And also because we're in the middle of a pandemic and people are wearing masks. I know some servers have worn different colored masks, and so if there was a red mask, how might would that actually have the same effect as the red lips or not? So looking at some of the studies that have been published in the past, there was a few projects done by a couple of researchers in France, Guégan and Jacob, and they identified actually two conclusions that were specific to what I wanted to do, and essentially took the form of a replication and an extension of their research. So the first study in 2012, they concluded that men tipped female servers who wore red lipstick at a higher rate than those who did not. So they actually did this as a field experiment, and so they collaborated with female waitstaff in restaurants and asked them to wear a particular color of lipstick during their shift, and then keep track of how many tips the total value of tips that they got. And they found that indeed, particularly with male customers, that the female servers received higher tips on average when they had the red lipstick on compared to another color. And then a couple years later, they published very similar results. It was a similar field experiment, but this time they manipulated the color of the shirts. So they had their female servers wear either a red t-shirt or a different colored t-shirt, and again asked them to keep track of the tips. Found roughly the same pattern, that the servers wearing the red shirt ended up receiving higher tips from their male customers. That second study did fail to replicate in at least one case. I'm going to talk about that on a later slide, but that's worth keeping in mind, and that was one of the reasons that this was kind of an interesting area to study. So I looked also at some of the psychological background, the theoretical reason that this effect might happen. And there's been quite a bit of research that suggests that the color red, like I said, is an indicator of sexuality, sexual readiness, sexual availability. So you can imagine, a female, and this is both in humans and in animals, they've seen that the lips sort of flush during sexual readiness, and other body parts as well. And so that can be an indicator to male humans or animals that there's a female who's sexually ready. And then there were a number of studies. Actually, this first one is kind of interesting because it goes beyond directly coloration on body parts, and just red in the proximity of an image of a woman in this one study showed that the male subjects observing images of women thought that they looked more attractive when they were sort of just in the vicinity of the color red. And then the second one that I'm highlighting here is particular to that red shirt. So again, a female sort of associated with the color red also was the male subjects in that experiment were more inclined to provide assistance or give attention to women just because of that color. So the idea that they're more sexually attractive, and also that the men are going to give them more attention in some way, sort of makes sense. So let me talk just briefly about this failure to replicate. So Mike Lynn, who you heard about from Dr. Brewster as well, he does a lot of research into tipping. He was interested enough in the Guégan and Jacob study about clothing color to attempt to replicate it. And so rather than a field experiment, he actually did a survey experiment, very much like the experiments that we're talking about today. And he found that he could not reproduce the same results that Guégan and Jacob did. In fact, he found that his waitresses actually received lower hypothetical tips with the red shirt. In another series of studies, Peppercorn et al. Found the same thing, that clothing color in those experiments did not affect attractiveness. And so neither of these suggested that what Gagon and Jacobs did was somehow faulty, but what they're noticing is that there may be other particular context-sensitive differences in what's going on. So Gagon and Jacobs did their studies in France in a culture where tipping is not necessarily the norm the way it is in the United States. Gratuities are sort of built into the bill, and then the tips are not necessarily expected, but they do come sometimes. So that's one difference, and then there are also potentially many cultural differences in terms of what is expected for a restaurant server to be wearing, or what sort of lipstick is considered normal, what's considered professional, and what's considered attractive. All those are potentially culturally different as well. When it came to the red lipstick, I am not aware of any replication attempts. So we had positive results from Gagon and Jacob, but that was also an area that was rich for further research to sort of verify that. So, what did we do here? I've lost track of which slide I'm on, so my notes are not so useful, but that's okay. What we did here was essentially the same sort of setup that Dr. Brewster was talking about with the mask versus non-mask. We wanted to do a survey experiment, so we provided a hypothetical vignette and gave them a picture of a server in various conditions and asked them how much they would tip. So we randomized the scenario based on the color red. Here we've got red lipstick. So we've got three hypothetical servers, each pictured with sort of neutral or natural colored lips, as well as a red colored lip. And it's probably really hard to see in this picture with the bad lighting and the projection, but when they actually took the experiment, it was like more of a full screen image, so it may have been more noticeable. But my hope was that it didn't look artificial, that it actually looked realistic. Just like with the masks that we used, that you saw from Dr. Brewster's study, these are generated with Photoshop. So we started with stock photography images of models that looked like they were restaurant servers, and then digitally manipulated the color of the lips to have one version that was natural and one version that was red. So the images are otherwise identical. And then we did the same thing with the mask color. So just like before, we superimposed a mask onto these same servers. And in this case, the mask was either black, white, or red. And then to wrap up the experiment, we asked the respondents how much they would tip. In this case, we actually had a random bill amount as well. So when we asked them to tip, we asked for a dollar amount, but we ended up converting that into a percentage to get a better baseline for comparison. And then we asked how attractive their server appeared on a 7-point scale. So it really is pretty close to the same setup as in the first study. So first thing that I did was attempted to replicate the Gagon and Jacob findings on lip color, and I began by using essentially the same model that they did in terms of a statistical analysis. So this is just looking at the direct effect of the variation in color on the amount of tip, and we see that there's not a correlation at all. For looking on the line with red lips, the 0.936 is the p-value, so there's almost no difference between red lips or not. Same thing in the second model, and the reason we've got a second model here is because Gagon and Jacob studied just male patrons and female servers. I included both male and female on both sides, so I wanted to make sure I was looking at the specific effect of sex in there. I didn't show it, but I also ran a model where I just filtered the data down to the male patrons and the female servers. Still no significant effect. However, I was also interested in exploring the theory behind that. So I took this a step further and came up with a moderated mediation model. And again, this follows kind of the same pattern. This time it's a little different than what Dr. Brewster was doing in the first study because we're looking at attractiveness instead of friendliness. But again, we've got this, rather than just a direct, does lip color affect the tip? Now we're looking for an indirect effect. So does the lip color cause an increase in perceived attractiveness that then may result in a higher tip because of the attractiveness? And again, this is all sort of mediated or moderated rather by sex. So it's the female servers where we would expect the lip color to increase the attractiveness, and it's the male patrons who we would expect to give higher tips based on that higher attractiveness. So after writing this model, I didn't give you all the detailed numbers this time like Dr. Brewster did, but just in summary, we saw even with this moderated mediation model, the overall effect is not significant. However, there were some interesting things in there. We did see to a statistically significant level that female servers with red lips are perceived as more attractive than the male server in our experiment. And male patrons give larger tips to attractive female servers. So this is kind of exactly what the theory was saying, even though it doesn't sort of generalize to the overall effect that Causal and Jacob saw. And then in the one case where we considered only male patrons, there is the overall significant indirect effect of red lips through the perceived attractiveness and moderated by server sex. So in other words, that specific case, it does get to the point where it is just crosses that threshold of statistical significance. So then I did basically the same thing again, this time looking at the mask color instead of the lip color. And again, I sort of expected or hypothesized that we'd see the same results based on what Causal and Jacob saw. So I ran the same models, essentially. Here's the direct effect. Does having a red mask increase tips? Well, no. At least not in the first model, although it's almost that p-value of 0.05 is sort of the traditional cutoff of what we call significant. So it's fairly close. It's 0.06 in the first model. It's 0.047 in the second model. So there is almost a direct effect there. However, in that second model, even though we have the significance on the red mask, it really doesn't line up with the same theory that it's the female servers and the male respondents driving this. And I ran the moderated mediation model to sort of break that down in a little more detail. But essentially what we're seeing, none of these other coefficients are significant, but the ones that are close sort of indicate a different effect than that. We actually see that if anything, it might be the male servers that are getting the higher tips rather than the female servers. So in conclusion with that, the direct effect of a red mask on tips bordered on statistical significance, but it's hard to be fully conclusive on that. And it was actually the male servers, not the females, who were perceived as more attractive with the red mask. But this effect was only significant for female patrons. So it was almost actually the opposite of what we saw with the lip color. So to the extent that the red mask color actually matters, the perceived attractiveness does not fully explain the effect that we saw on tips, and other factors are likely at work. So specifically, some of the other theories that we came up with to support that are this idea of color being related to professionalism, or competency, or authority. All of those things sort of may fit in there. So it's not necessarily the sexual attractiveness in the case of the mask, which is sort of interesting that that's different. So to sort of look at that another way, we didn't see the red mask effect that we expected, but remember we were testing red, black, and white. We did see a white mask effect that showed up, so So the red masks resulted in the highest level of attractiveness. Black masks were just right below that. The white masks were significantly lower in terms of attractiveness. And so that the theory doesn't really explain that difference the way that we expected it to. But again, that may have something to do with professionalism or what's expected. I know black clothing for restaurant servers and restaurant workers often is associated with a higher level of establishment or a more professional person involved in there, so that may have something to do with that. Unfortunately, we didn't test any of those things, so we can just sort of guess on that. But despite the limitations in the study, we do find strong support for this server attractiveness being a significant predictor of tipping amount, but only by male tippers. So that much at least we can say with relative certainty. So overall, service industry managers and workers have an ongoing interest in providing the most satisfying service possible, and tipping is a good indicator of whether or not they're doing that. So we do see that the color of red has intriguing effects that in some cases may lead patrons to reward servers with higher tips. The context really matters here. So in the case of the lip color, it's certainly the sexual context, with the face masks, there may be other things going on besides that, such as professionalism or status. And so those could be areas where interesting future research could look at that effect. So that's pretty much what we've got. How are we doing on time? I'm sure we've got some time to talk about some questions or comments on either of the two studies.